Hello and welcome to the Old Garage, number 11. I'm Wild Bill, and we got some questions here today, so let's just roll into them here. Daniel Silverthorne has posed the following. When were the first radios mounted in cars from the factory, not modified in later by an owner or someone else? I imagine that their inclusion in a car would have been astounding and quite novel initially, but probably quickly took the industry by storm. Well, when you're talking radios, I mean, keep in mind that the automotive industry and the radio industry actually kind of developed at about the same time in the Victorian era, but it was not until after World War I that a radio was actually built that was small enough to even fit in a car. And that was due to the work of a man by the name of Powell Crossley, who was sometimes called the Henry Ford of the radio, who was the first to build a radio that was both affordable and small. But it wasn't until 1924 that a radio receiver was actually put into a car, and that was actually happened in Australia. But when it comes to whether it was factory installed, you have to remember that there were, in the late 20s and early 30s, there were companies that you could buy a chassis from, like Rolls-Royce or Duesenberg, and then take that chassis and send it to a company that would then put a body on it, you know, be it Brewster or Fleetwood or whoever. And from about 1925 onward, you could get a radio put in one of those if you wanted to. By 1930, there was a company that came out with a product called the Motorola, which was an aftermarket radio, and they even called it Motorola as a kind of a pun on Victrola, because you know, it was, you know, a Victrola you use on land, the Motorola you use in your car, you know, kind of thing. But it was the advancements in vacuum tube technology, etc., that allowed that to happen. But they were still pretty expensive. And part of the problem with car radios wasn't just how big they were and the fact they were able to miniaturize them. It was being able to power them. Because your typical radio of the time required 120 volts, as well as some significant amperage, whereas your typical car ran on 6 volts and didn't have the kind of power requirements. So it wasn't until 1933 actually that a company equipped a car with a radio that could operate off of the power that a car could supply, and that company was coincidentally called Crossley. No relation to Powell Crossley of American fame. This was actually the Crossley with one S motor company in England that in 1933 did actually have a, not a Crossley but a Motorola radio fixed as equipment from the factory, bodied by the factory, that was your first radio. But you know, by that time we're already in 1933. So, in fact, the first car I ever owned myself was a 1948 DeSoto, and it had a radio, and it worked. And I thought it was kind of like the movie Christine, where it only played old music, but it really didn't. It just played what was available then. But hey, there you go. Okay, James MacArthur question. What do you consider the time frame for this channel, and what is considered vintage cars? I seem to recall vintage was considered maybe 50 years old or so, and antique was 100 years old or older. Well, when it comes to just automotive history or just counting cars as it were, there's really 4 terms you're going to use for the older cars, and that's going to be classic, antique, veteran, and vintage. And they have different meanings. Classic and antique are actually legal terms that you're going to find used when importing or exporting vehicles in or out of a country. Classic is a vehicle that is old enough to where it can be, for historical reasons, imported or exported to or from a country without modification. Different countries have different, ages where this is allowable. Most common is 25, though 29, 31, 32, and 35, can also be found in various legislations. But this is where, the basis legally where classic comes from. It's a car that you can bring in from one country to another without having to modify it itself, although you may have restrictions on its use. Antique is a much broader term. It not only includes cars, but it can also include other things that you would import or export from a country that are 100 years old or older. And there's some countries there where it's 90, some where it's 110, but usually right around 100 years old, it classifies as antique. Again, there are going to be restrictions on, how it's how you can use it or display it or do whatever once it's in the country, but you don't have to modify the object itself. Now, this is important if you're, like, say, in Australia, and you want to import a car and say it's only 18 years old and you're importing it from America. Well, guess what? You're going to have to convert it from left to right-hand drive. You're going to have to do all kinds of other stuff to it. It's not going to be worth it. Whereas if it's old enough, you don't have to make those restrictions. And the word classic defines that. And when it comes to something that is more of a museum piece, antique covers that, and it's all about international trade law. When it comes to the terms vintage and veteran, it's a different story. These actually speak to very specific eras of automotive development amongst historians, the vintage era being prior to World War I. And vintage is, you can argue whether it really ended with the standardization of electric starter, which didn't actually happen until 1912, but pretty much by the beginning of World War I, the vintage era was concluded. This was when the basic technologies, in its simplest sense, had been established. Not perfected, of course, across the board, but at least established. Whereas veteran is referring to the era of cars that happened after World War I and that generation of cars. And that generation was, of course, from about 1919 up until about 1932, once you start having even more advances in not only legislation, but the amount of cars. Ford came out with his, his flathead V8, etc., single cast, etc. So, but from 1919 to 1932 is veteran. These are the cars that were benefiting specifically from the technologies that were developed as a result of World War I. And that's where you have things like hydraulic brakes coming around. That's where you actually have the kind of shocks we're more familiar with, synchronous transmission, etc. Lots of things came around during that era that we take for granted for now. But those are the definitions. And as far as this channel is concerned, obviously at the moment I'm really focused on the vintage era. In fact, even the Victorian portion of it. I haven't even gotten to really the 20th century part. And afterwards, I will be, going back and forth between the era and the veteran, because there's a lot in the veteran era that's really cool, and I can talk about that with decency as well. Once you get past 1932, I like it, but I'm not the expert, and I'd rather pass those over to plenty of other channels that really go over it way better than I do. But great question, thank you. Okay, Christopher Landstrom, say, they were ahead of their time. Oh, I'm sorry. This is regarding the Moeller and DeGrasse. It says they were ahead of their time with assembly in Mexico and sale in the U.S. Did transatlantic export occur during the early days, or was the distance and ocean too much? Well, actually, no, it wasn't, because there were two ways then, and still now for that matter, to export product and technology from one side to the other. You're either going to build your product, stick it on a ship, and sail it over, or you're going to build or draw the designs, patent the designs, license the designs, sail the designs over, and let them build them where their company is. And both were done, back and forth. You had Duryea was being licensed and sold in Europe. You had Humber being licensed and sold in USA. So as far as moving automobiles, yes, physically it was done, but it was actually more common to just simply license the production of the product. This happened famously in World War One and World War Two. I mean, so many French and British designs were built in the U.S. during both wars. It's crazy, and but we just tooled up for it, and that was in most cases a lot easier than just shipping them over. Once you had more mass production, again, getting past World War One. I mean, Henry Ford obviously was doing shipping before then, but in that era, you're going to have a lot more of moving product. But prior to that, mostly you're moving ideas, and you know what? Ideas sell, still do for that matter. Okay, Vaclav Fate. Ooh. What was the first automotive logo? There are plenty of badges around nowadays, and many of them with their roots in the vintage era. Bavarian colors of BMW, the chevron gear teeth of Citroën, etc. But they're not the oldest, I wager. You'd wager correctly. Boy, I had to think long and hard on this question, because here's the thing. What is a logo? Okay? Because if you say that a logo is any kind of stylized representation, then the list is long, what it could be. So let's kind of look at them. If, for example, in the automotive industry, since that's exactly what we're speaking of, we're going to have to go to really who were the first, and that's going to be, as far as cars are concerned, that's going to be Benz, and also De Dion Bouton, even though it wasn't a gas-powered, technically what he was offering in 1884 was a car. Now, both of these cars did have badges on them. Now, in the case of Benz's car, the badge was the Benz Z badge. It was a stylized name. It was written out, in a font. For De Dion Bouton, it was simply the D and B, but it was just stylized letters. Now, which one of them were first? Well, De Dion Bouton was the first, logo specifically made for a car. However, the Benz Z logo existed before the De Dion Bouton logo, because the company preceded De Dion Bouton for about a year and a half as an engine builder and simply used the same placard and emblem or logo for their company. But let's now look a little differently, because you mentioned Bavaria. If you consider a nation's colors or nation's flag to be a logo, well, I'm going to say that's probably cheating, because I don't think that would really constitute an automotive logo, unless the country itself made the car. So if we then go, what about a stylized logo, something that is not just initials or a name, but rather a figure or a symbol? Then what car company has the oldest of those? And that is going to go to Peugeot, actually. The Lion Rampant was the family logo of that company since the late 18th century. And that company's logo continued on through the development of Peugeot as a family symbol. It was part of the company. Peugeot was simply another family company, and therefore, in my opinion, the oldest logo ever on a car is that found on a modern Peugeot. There you go. All right, Spirit Fox NY, he asked, I keep hearing about the rough roads we're in America. When did the U.S. road system improve enough for cars to be a common feature, or did it take the invention of more sophisticated suspension systems? You know what, I've been asked this actually a couple of times in various different ways. America, car road development didn't happen during the Victorian era, which is where I'm at right now. And it really didn't start occurring until right before World War One. And it wasn't until afterwards that roads, in the United States started getting taken seriously, at least from city to city. There were, of course, utility roads for railroads. In other words, there were areas you could drive a car along the support road for the railroad, but you weren't allowed to use those unless you were railroad people. Um, but that is a huge topic. Actually, it's big, and the suspension system's also big. I will get into them, once I can crawl myself out of the Victorian era. But we will get to them. Okay, trust me, we will. Okay, and regarding the Motoring Monarchs episode, Gabriel F. has asked, if much of the early development of automobiles was focused on the nobility and the wealthy, did anyone foresee the future of the scale of the automobile before 1900? Are there, for instance, any science fiction authors or similar who predicted mass ownership of cars before it actually started happening later in the first decade of the 20th century? Great question. It didn't really start happening until the second decade, but yes, as far as writers. Now, science fiction writers, I mean, outside of Jules Verne, I'm not that much into, but I can tell you that during the Victorian era, there were gazillions of periodicals and scientific writers and magazines and such that were going around, and futurists and economics, economists of the time, they were actually predicting it. They were saying that, someday there will be networks across the continent, or from state to state, or from town to town. Of course, they were talking about flying cars by, the 1930s too. But the examples of this would be, there are thousands of them. Just talking about what was going to happen and what they were looking forward to. It was absolutely possible, and it did happen, and they pulled it off, and awesome. And I have a question here from Craig Hagenbrook, and he asks, with the invention of the automobile, how long did it take before speed limits became a thing, and signs like stop, give way, turn right, etc., also come to be, and also the horn? How did it come about? Well, I hate to break it to you, Craig, but the horn and the speed limit far predate the car. Speed limits have existed since governments began building roads. You will find legislation in record of, early as Vespasian, that if you rode a horse at, full run through the city of Rome, you could get fined. Road safety has been a part of roads since the beginning. They may not have used it in terms of miles an hour. It may have been a horse walk or a man's walk or a trot, etc., to express the speed limit, but they've been with us the entire time. And once you start getting larger wagons and carriages on roads, and this is long before there were cars, those wagons and carriages within certain city limits within most countries were required to have certain things, including lights, including horns, bells in many cases as well. These legislations were in place pretty much worldwide in industrial nations long before the car existed. And when cars first began, they simply put these things onto cars until such time came that cars had the ability to move faster than these modes of transportations, and things like you're speaking of, higher speed limits, signs that you didn't have to stop and read because you're going so slow, etc., developed. But they did develop, and we will go into those in future episodes, I can assure you. But as far as the speed limit and the horn, a lot older than the car. Okay, I got one more here, and this is another James MacArthur question. And he says, one last question at this time. How did you acquire your expertise? Toot your horn and give us a little of your background in this area. Okay. Well, I have a degree, and it's 98.6. I've never been to college or anything. Just an enthusiast. When I was a very young boy, this is 1971, we were moving, and I was riding in the moving van, and we pulled in for gas, and I saw a car that was unlike anything else I'd ever seen. Now, in 1971, I mean, cars of the 50s were just typical used cars on the road, and cars from the 40s and 30s weren't necessarily out of place. But this car was different, and I remember I asked my mom. She took me to the library for like a couple of weeks because I remembered what this car looked like, and it took me a couple of weeks to find it, and I found it in one of Peter Roberts' actual books, and it was a 1914 Stutz Bearcat. That was the car I saw, and then I read about it. It was the car they make good in a day. What did that mean? And and I'm a very young child. I mean, I'm under the age of 6. And I just took off from there. I've just been an enthusiast ever since. To me, this is an era of automotive history, especially the vintage era, that is largely forgotten. People don't know about it. They know about Henry Ford, maybe. They may have even heard of Oldsmobile. They maybe know, they've heard of Rolls-Royce, and they've heard of Peugeot perhaps, but it's just not known, and there's not a lot of places where you can find it. And I think it's the universe next door. There's just so much going on in this industry at this time. It's fascinating to me, and so that's why I've just been an enthusiast. I'm no expert. I just dig the stuff, and so there you go. So those are the questions I had for this week. I do have a little bit of admin, a tiny bit, and that is that because of some changes in my work responsibilities, I am going to have to start filming some episodes remotely. Not in my studio, but doing them, quite frankly, at whatever hotel or backdrop I find, wherever town I'm going to be in. But still, that's not going to change, the schedule. We're still going to be making the show. Anyway, hey, thanks for watching The Old Garage, and we will see you next time. Peace.